to, if they've got a question, they can just unmute themselves and ask a question.
Okay.
Okay. So I think what we can do now, you can switch off your video for now, and then we will mute yourself, and then we will then ask Kama to let them in. I'll also do the same thing myself, as mute myself and switch off the video and let people to come in. And then after when we've seen how many people have logged in, we then start the video clip.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. All the best. So you may let them in, Kamu.
Okay. I'm a gynecologist, obstetrician. I'm founder of this hospital. I've been there since it was started. I work hard, I just deliver babies. I'm a delivery boy. I came back from England being a specialist. I had no access to especially private hospital services. So we had to build our own hospital. You know, those days are apartheid days. Patients were allowed in the private hospital, but I was not allowed to go and see the patients there. So I was disadvantaged in that way. And the old visionary doctors like Dr. Mutlana, Dr. Mokhesi, thought of an idea of having a black hospital. That's about 30 years ago. And this hospital, they went looking for money and they built the hospital. It has been flourishing since then. There are people who didn't believe that a private hospital could start. But there was one particular doctor, I must mention him, Dr. Mutlana. He had that vision that one day things will change. It has been expanded by clinics and Dr. Matsike to what it is today. It's one of the best hospitals in Johannesburg. Now there's an avalanche of black doctors of all disciplines. I'm vindicated, I feel vindicated, I'm excited about that. There's more staff, there's more nurses, and it's a happy environment. High-class theaters, second to none in this country. You need to have special facilities for black people here. So this place grew. They saw the potential of this place. It can still, it has a capacity, of serving a community of 4 million people. It hasn't reached its capacity yet.
Good evening, colleagues, and thank you and welcome once more to our weekly webinars hosted by Clinics Health Group. And it's always a pleasure to see you coming back every week to join us for these engaging discussions. And we trust that we'll also have another engaging discussion this evening as we try to get speakers who are quite experienced in their own fields, other academically also in the field in which they are working. And this is by no means a different invitation or webinar that we're having hosting this evening. As usual, note that these webinars are CPD accredited. And so we trust that when you registered for the webinar, you also indicated your name, full name and details, email address, and also your contact details, and also the registration number, whether with the HPCSA or Nursing Council or the Pharmacy Council or any other regulatory body that you are registered with, so that we then submit your registration certificate or your attendance to the relevant authorities who will then register you and get your CPD points from the relevant body. And we also request that, as usual, that you switch off your video and also switch off your audio, mute yourselves so that we have maximum reception during the presentations. And also note that these webinars are recorded on YouTube. So anyone who wants to watch this recording of the presentation may do so at your own leisure later on. We also want to encourage you to give us feedback so that when we, at the end of the presentation, the following day, we send you a link and we want to hear your feedback about these webinars, whether you like the topics that we present to you, the speakers that we present, and the formats in which we present these webinars. We've been doing this for the last 2 years since the beginning of the lockdown, when the lockdown started and for the pandemic, and as we were all staying at home, and we haven't stopped that. And so we want to be the thought leader as Clinics Health Group, so that we engage in different topics, ethical topics or business matters related to provision of healthcare, and academic points, and also assist with the emerging trends in healthcare delivery. And so this evening we are excited that we have one of the activists in our communities in healthcare, Dr. Aslam Dasoo, is a graduate from the Nelson Mandela School of Medicine at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. You know that it used to be the University of Natal. He graduated as a medical doctor in 1986 there. And his career spans many practices. He's worked in the public sector and also in the private sector, civic, trades union, and political activist in the 1980s and 90s, and he has contributed to the development of national health policy for post-apartheid South Africa. And he has extensive public policy experience and has held appointments to the Medicine Pricing Committee, the Road Accident Fund, and as chairman of Charlotte McClarky Johannesburg Academic Hospital. Currently is the chairman of the board of Association of Palliative Care Centers, formerly the Hospice and Palliative Care Association, HPCA, not HPCSA. He joined the corporate sector in 1996 as a policy director for the health insurance industry body, and led his transformation to the board of healthcare funders of Southern Africa, and is a director of companies and is currently MD of Health Equity Partners, a healthcare advisory consultancy. And Dr. Dasoo is a convener of the Progressive Health Forum. I'm sure you've seen him appear on TV many times as a national advocacy network, which is an advocacy network of health professionals, public health experts, scientists, and health activists concerned with the performance and responsiveness of South Africa's healthcare delivery system. With the advent of COVID, the pandemic 2020, he convened the science reference group of the Progressive Health Forum, which comprised South Africa's leading medical scientists, which provided scientific leadership and activism on the vaccine procurement. He has been quite in the forefront, vaccine procurement, treatment, protocols, and guidance on the national response. And we are glad at Clinics that he's accepted an invitation to join us this evening and speak about healthcare as a business and the moral challenge. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Aslam Dasoo, to the Clinics fraternity. We've got quite a number of people who are quite interested to hearing from you. Just to know that Dr. Dasoo is not doing a presentation like we normally do in academic style. He'll be talking to us. There are no slide presentations. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Forgive me if the lighting seems a bit odd. We're in the midst of load shedding, so that might change for the better shortly. But
it's
good
fine
evening
at the moment.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Ray, for your very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for making the time to participate in this webinar organized by Clinics. So the topic of this address is healthcare as a business, the moral challenge. I'm not sure why I was asked to do a talk on the moral challenge, but thinking about it, I realized that actually it's a very germane issue, especially today in South Africa, and it's worth talking about. So I would have titled it, healthcare business, the business of mortality. But I'll leave that for Ray and them to work through. So it's inevitable that commerce in the field of healthcare, invested as it is with profound ethical rules and governed by extensive regulatory regimes, is a fraught undertaking at the best of times, with even legitimate profitability frequently being the lightning rod for many with very strong views on the matter. It's always a privilege, however, to engage with peers on the meaningful exigencies of one of the most important endeavors of our time, as the world around us becomes more volatile and the lot of vast swathes of humanity becomes more precarious. So that endeavor is healthcare in 2022, specifically its availability and its enterprise. Now, both these are germinal aspects of healthcare and are in continuous flux, responding both to political economy and shaped by the ongoing evolution of the means of its provision. Now, nothing in the human experience is of greater personal import by virtue of its intimacy with one's mortality, nor in its importance to the disposition of nations in their quest for prosperity and progress. So I shall cover three interlocking areas on the subject that I believe are necessary to not only place in context the specific object of this webinar, that is the moral challenge in healthcare as commerce, but to try and seed in the minds, especially of those here who are in the nascent or early stages of their careers, that to better understand the purpose of the health professional and those with whom they work, it is necessary to accept that healthcare is at once artful, scientific, economic, and a political undertaking. Its centrality in the modern experience is all too apparent when one has regard for the fact that the well-being of the people is meaningless without their self-knowledge, the means, and the access to all necessary healthcare intervention. No nation or society has ever prospered or made progress with persistent pestilence or with the debilitating effects of its manufactured or natural environmental degradation. So the first of these three contextual propositions are put forward to help interrogate the topic we traverse this evening is a reference to the geological epochs. Now, some of you may have learned of this geological epoch lessons in the development of the planet and the living beings that it harbors. These are, of course, vast periods of time, millions of years in the measure, bookended by distinct transformations or disruptions that are to be found in the geological record of the Earth. Now, the latest iteration of these epochs has been labeled the Anthropocene, so called because it coincides not only with the rise of Homo sapiens, but more specifically, the impact of the development of their reason and their mastery at manipulating the observable world. But it is its relative brevity that makes the Anthropocene an outlier in the taxonomy of these epochal periods, lasting not millions of years, but only a few hundred, during which time the planet has undergone more fundamental change, even as its innate and vast tidal astronomical patterns persist or are affected by our genus. In this reading, the Anthropocene is less of an accelerated human development embedded in and in rhythm with the infinite patterns of the natural world, but marked more by an alarming dissonance, divergence from the natural order, and a potential beginning of the end of life on the planet as we know it. The Anthropocene is marked by the impact of humans on the natural world in the modern era, most notably by the distinct but asynchronous crises that innovates our collective endeavors today. We've all heard of the biblical 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It's a useful metaphor for discussing the Anthropocene. So the first horseman of this modern apocalyptic time is global climate collapse, making this century the most perilous yet for life on the planet. All our many plans, desires, hopes, endeavors are like chaff in the wind of the full-blown calamity that is unfolding and that awaits us, with just a smidgen of hope that we can mitigate its worst effects through unprecedented collective action, which is often a forlorn hope at the best of times, not least because of the other horsemen that are coming along for the ride. So the second of these horsemen, modern harbingers of this Anthropocene apocalypse, both as a cause and an effect of the climate calamity, showing how it's interlocked, is the crisis in neoliberal capitalism as the proximate cause of the runaway growth in inequality, preventing effective collaboration across borders and across classes to mitigate social and environmental disaster. And it portends a zero-sum outcome as accumulation accompanied by an inevitable corruption eventually collapses into chaos for people and planet. The early signs are already there. The third of these horsemen is the loss of capacity of states to maintain solvency and coherence of their social and political orders. The retreat of states from fulfilling their democratic promise arises as a consequence of the economic pressure from the crisis in capitalism and increasingly uncontrollable demographic trends, where state capacity to meet the latter is constrained by the former. The fourth horseman has arrived more recently on the scene. It's COVID-level pandemics. In the last 100 years, we've witnessed the emergence of an increased number of these pandemics, caused not by the pathogens of old, but by newer zoonotic phenomena. So from the Spanish flu, whose progeny is still in circulation, we have encountered in increasing frequency pandemics like HIV/AIDS, Ebola, SARS, MERS, Zika, so many others, finding humans to be perfectly hospitable hosts. Deforestation and the resulting decimation of megafauna, our large animals, creates savanna-like conditions with smaller fauna less capable of sequestering microorganisms than large animal reservoirs. The resulting human encroachment on these habitats and the decrease in availability of basic food crops, both due to inefficient markets, as we see in the modern economic crisis, and declining crop yields due to climate collapse, increases the likelihood that these small wild animals now will be increasingly used as food. Moreover, the calamitous destruction of biodiversity means that an exponential increase in the likelihood of both naturally occurring or synthetically produced pestilence grows. If one has regard for the fact that a mere 400 years ago, in the early Anthropocene, terrestrial animal biomass was divided into 90% wildlife and 10% humans and their livestock. By 2000, estimates verge on the reverse, with only 10% being wildlife and 90% being humans and their livestock. That's the impact our species have had on the planet in such a short space of time. Now, these factors were the proximate causes of all the pandemics we have witnessed. But pandemics also have recurring themes that it will serve us well to remember. And Professor Howard Phillips from UCT in his study on pandemics, identifies these themes. The first is a revelation. Pandemics reveal. They reveal the fractures in society, the fissures in society, the difficulties that society has to overcome in order to maintain stability. They also accelerate latent trends and develop, and those are both good and bad. But they also pronounce the existence of innate passions in society, whether it's prejudice, entrepreneurship, and so on. And lastly, they initiate new ways of thinking. And this has been the pattern of pandemics all the way through. And initiating new ways of thinking at the end of a pandemic must be the subject of all our thoughts. And the best way to do that is to have an open, formal process of an inquiry into how this pandemic affected us and how we responded to it. Excuse me. So, in planning for any major development of society, including ours, we would be wise to factor in these exigencies of the Anthropocene, or they may upend our best laid plans. The second of the three contextual propositions that one must have regard for is the evolution of healthcare over time from a traditional endeavor steeped in myth and mystery to one of high science, discovery, and economics. Indeed, the emergence of modern healthcare has been in tandem with the gradual modernization of society over the last several thousand years, and especially so over the last 200 years. And with increasing globalization comes the dissemination of knowledge. With industrialization comes research, discovery, and technology, the movement of people, goods, and capital, and the division of labor. Now, healthcare has evolved accordingly, and its demarcation and distribution becomes a function of these global forces. Now, the political economy of healthcare is a real revelation. The pharmaceutical industry, for example, the bedrock of allopathic medicine, is also the third largest manufacturing industry in the world, after petroleum and armaments. And like these sectors, inevitably comes up against the solid wall of ethics or the bristling forces of activism. It's not hard to see why. The financialization of the healthcare industry through the investment of non-healthcare related capital allocation, seeking good returns or taking refuge in defensive equities during periods of turbulence, is a proximate reason that most healthcare management is now the discipline of business schools. George Merck, the founder of Merck, the pharmaceutical giant we're all aware of, made an observation that might have created a less astringent business model for the industry. In an address to shareholders back in the day, when Merck was mainly family-owned, he famously said, "We try to remember that medicine is for the patient. We try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow. And if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. The better we have remembered it, the larger they have been." The market mechanism of financialization goes even further. Public health bodies, like the WHO, uses the vocabulary and analyses of markets, such as the term, for example, coverage, an insurance concept based on a utilitarian principle of healthcare as financially distinct units. Excuse me. Thereby determining the primary context of its delivery in financial terms and disregarding the notion that healthcare by any definition is first and foremost a public good. It's no good to aver repeatedly that national insurance for any form of social protection is consistent with access to care. In healthcare terms, the very notion of coverage implies access for those who are covered, which is an insidious demarcation that neither makes sense if one accepts healthcare as a public good, nor in its argument that coverage insures people against very predictable risk. And yet, health insurance, commercial or public, is becoming the dominant mode of access to healthcare worldwide. In the sphere of private enterprise, health insurance, like any other form of insurance, is also subject to market competition. Now, at its most benign, the goal of competitors is to prevail, not to preserve competition in the market. There is therefore an inevitable tendency toward monopoly or oligopoly. And so antitrust and anti-competitive laws against anti-competitive behavior seek to constrain this beast, but with limited success, especially in healthcare markets, where the asymmetry of information between provider and user is so vast. That health insurance emerges from market economics must imply that the social determinants of health are also market-related. On a cursory examination, we find that this is indeed the case. So all healthcare systems begin with sufficient nutrition, potable water, sanitation, adequate shelter, basic education, personal and communal safety, and the opportunity for gainful employment. The modern healthcare delivery system has evolved to deal with the outcomes of the breakdown in any of these essential elements that make up society. And every healthcare delivery system is a mirror of how well or poorly the social determinants of health are being managed. Market economies develop inherent inequality, with only the best governance and sufficient social protection rendering it tolerable. It is therefore no surprise that in market economies like ours and several others, health systems are overburdened due to the inability to attenuate the effects of these social determinants of health breaking down. So we can have a market economy, but not a market society. In addition to markets, there must be institutions of law and justice, of social protection from the vagaries of life and the markets, and of inalienable social entitlements and human rights. Now, that's the benchmark of a civilizational order by which to measure a free society, which is what we aspire to. This brings me to the third contextual proposition through which to interrogate the moral challenge of healthcare business. Firstly, the provision of care for the ill in ancient times was invariably rewarded with a tithe, a barter, or coins. And this pattern has been a tacit form of commerce in the provision of care right up to the present. To the extent that healthcare in the era of modern religion is regarded as a calling It is time we dispensed with the myth of a divine injunction to heal. In a recent study in the US on attitudes among health workers to their work being a calling, 2/3 of practicing professionals agreed with the proposition. But it was in their conceptual framework that one finds that they mean less an adherence to a godly command than to a more secular belief. To wit, and I quote, they say a calling usually means a feeling of deep sense of purpose about one's profession, being personally invested in one's work, and an alignment of values, where a job is primarily about earning a paycheck and a means to an end that can allow for personal investment in other areas of life. So, payment for healthcare services rendered by a professional is perfectly sound. And by extrapolation, by organized healthcare as well. It is less clear-cut, however, when the provision of a mass service such as hospitalization is predicated entirely on a market-based financial return, bringing us to the nub of whether it is moral in this instance. Financialization alters incentives in the provision of care. The search for yield, profit, or return on investment follows well-developed market pathways that may and often do diverge from the ethical remit, say, of healthcare professionals. And it inevitably leads to altered incentives for the professionals who share in the return either directly or indirectly. It must therefore be an abiding concern in public policy that a public good, such as healthcare, is not subject to the insidious incentives of investor returns alone. Now, the whole world grapples with this phenomenon, some more successfully than others, but all having to accept excuse me, that the provision of care comes at material cost. Someone pays, whoever that may be. It also helps enormously to dispense with ideological predilection in the provision of health, even though the available evidence indicates that, given proper funding and ethical stewardship, access to care offers little distinction between profit-making provision or public tax-funded provision, provided that the experience of the patient is to all intents and purposes the same. And it is in that proposition we find the parameters by which to organize and deliver healthcare. It is not in the philosophical or ideological agonizing over the morality of profiting from healthcare that an optimal system of care emerges, but rather from the astute analysis of the reality of this moment. Now, South Africa's public healthcare delivery system is far and away the most distributed and comprehensive to be found anywhere on our continent, and in most of the global South, for that matter. It has the makings, I beg your pardon, some now severely eroded, of a national health system resembling, but for South Africa's political economy, the British system, namely a tax-funded and publicly managed system of care, of free access, and of very good standard. Now, the British NHS and similar systems operate alongside privately financed healthcare delivery facilities and professionals. The latter carefully regulated so that they cannot profit from ethical indifference or from the public purse, either directly or indirectly. These are the hazards that we know exist in the sector. So private healthcare is, therefore, an essential democratic freedom limited only by the probity of the ethics that govern it and the avoidance of exploitation. In South Africa, the National Health Policy of 1997 developed after years of research and public participation, and which also accounted for the constitutional quirk of a provincial delivery mandate and a poorly regulated private health sector. The policy was predicated on exactly this understanding. By 2007, the carefully calibrated and curated reform was on course to realize the promise of an integrated health system anchored by the public health service, operating alongside a well-regulated, profitable private health market in a seamlessly integrated universal system of access, which is what Section 27 of the Constitution enjoins us to produce. In a single meeting in 2008 of the ANC Health Subcommittee, attended by its resurgent left allies, all cockahoo at the ousting of what they considered the neoliberal standard-bearer-in-chief, this new and poorly informed elite took the fateful decision to ditch the National Health Policy of 97, which was well underway, and replace it with an unresearched and uncosted piece of populist rhetoric called NHI. The government, now duly committed, had to scramble now to retrofit this policy into our healthcare reality. It spent billions on consultants and research and pilot projects on finding ways to make it work. Its latest iteration showing little advance on its obvious unsuitability in the 15 years that it has been bandied about. Meanwhile, the unsuitability of public health being a provincial competence, which simply devolved an integrated system into a gerrymandered provincial polity, indistinct in many ways from the former homelands, was worsened by the benign, and some would say criminal, neglect of the years that followed this shift in policy. And it has resulted in a fractured and inchoate potpourri of different provincial standards of care and their management, united only in their constant deterioration. Moreover, ignoring the urgent and important task of proper regulation of the private sector during that period simply allowed the private health market to grow, bolstered by the decline in the stewardship of public health, which saw the migration of the middle classes towards self-funded care, prepared to pay eye-watering premiums to avoid the growing depredations of the public health service. And ironically, even with all its travails and its limited envelope of care, private delivery systems are remarkably standardized, which in no small measure is the clear effect of market discipline instead of political fiat being the operating principle. Now keep that point in mind. As for the delusions of NHI, all one can say is that it is likely to fall under the weight of its own contradictions. But that too will not be cost-free to us. We can count the cost in 15 wasted years, the deterioration of the public health service, upon whom 85% of the population relies, the untrammeled financial growth of private healthcare, still only catering for the same measly proportion of the population that it did for the last 20 years. This, instead of having a large portion of the population under the 1997 policy employed and able to fund for their care, supported by risk equalization, joining that market. Instead, what we have is a limited client base, great supply, but in order to maintain inflation-beating returns, it has to become more and more expensive. And so we now reap the wind we have sown. So in conclusion, to the proposition that there is a moral challenge to doing business in healthcare, we are first obliged to accept that no contradiction exists, provided that the business operates within a cogent ethical and regulatory framework applicable to the service it provides. This must include a sound prohibition for profit to arise from assimilation of public resources, such as health professionals trained on the public purse or tax credits for the health insurances that finance private healthcare. Simply because these conditions do not prevail sufficiently in South Africa does not mean that the business of mortality has a moral hazard to it. Indeed, correct reform and enlightened stewardship is necessary to protect society from an unhealthy model of commerce. But we must accept, similarly, that the financialization of healthcare business remains a risk even under these conditions. So I have tried in this address to you, in addressing the topic by offering a set of lenses through which to come to the kernel of the question, including locating thought and practice of healthcare within the context of a world in peril, and a sector, an industry that is subject to the powerful forces of globalism, but in which healthcare can be ethically delivered at a profit. And finally, in our unique circumstances in South Africa, an understanding of the timeline that brings us to this moment, where this question has now become an immovable ideological divide. So as I began on the issue of climate change, let me end with a quote, or rather a characterization by the late Professor James Lovelock, the great environmentalist, that the Earth is a planet-sized organism. And I think in that we find our place. And this question especially gets answered clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aslam, for such a powerful presentation. And if we were able to have an audience, would be clapping our hands and applauding you for this powerful exposition of healthcare, and also take it from time immemorial and take us to the ages, and showing how healthcare has evolved from being a healthcare delivery system for individuals and families, and now it has become a big healthcare delivery system involving the public. And as you've indicated, that we have now come to see healthcare delivery. It looks like my internet connection is stable. You can still hear me, I hope. And that's the problem is about financialization of the healthcare delivery system, as you've mentioned. And your last point, you were saying that there is nothing wrong with privatization of health, as long as it does not benefit from the public resources. I mean, it does not benefit those who are involved in healthcare delivery, if I heard you well. But also that there is an issue about regulation, that there must be a lot of regulation. But isn't that a something that might stifle innovation, as you mentioned earlier on, that also what the lessons that we learned from COVID, the pandemic, so in general, is that once we go through pandemics, there is innovation. And we've seen that quite a lot of innovation primarily comes from the private health sector. Having been involved in the vaccination project within the private healthcare industry with other role players outside from our group, with all other stakeholders. We've seen quite a lot of private healthcare entities coming together and making sure that we join hands together with the public sector to overcome the pandemic. Just innovation stifled with more regulation.
Well, I think it's important that we understand that healthcare business, by its very nature, has to be regulated in terms of the public good. Now, you can use a mendacious form of regulation designed to stifle the delivery of care. But sensible, reasonable regulation should be designed to allow for that innovation and enterprise, but without compromising the necessary ethical investiture in healthcare. And I think private healthcare providers know this now, and over time they've learned this. The fact that they interact so strongly with health professionals who are embedded in those ethical frameworks obviously helps, because I have not known a more activist profession that looks after its ethics as the healthcare professions do. And I think business has agglomerated around that. However, the financialization does maintain an inherent risk all the time. And that's where I think regulations have to be a living, constant endeavor, cooperative, in order to prevent that from emerging. It is always something to be vigilant over. But there is no contradiction whatsoever in private business involving itself in healthcare, provided it meets those requirements. Indeed, that's all that's ever driven healthcare all through the ages.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. Colleagues, if I don't see questions in the chat like this, if you have a question, please do post your questions in the chat box. And also, if you do want to talk, if you may just raise your hand, and then we'll recognize you and mute yourself and ask a question. You've mentioned about the emergence of NHI as a departure from the national health policy of the ANC, and that you do have criticisms about that, and that it does not necessarily may not necessarily answer the questions of healthcare provision in South Africa, as you've so eloquently indicated that the private health sector is growing and still looking after the same number of the population that we had at the beginning, and nothing has changed. And when I read the HMI, it still speaks about the private health sector still getting the profits from delivery of healthcare. What are the main differences that you would, maybe for the purpose of this audience, that makes the distinction between the NHI and the national health policy that was a policy of the ANC?
So this is a big question and a big subject, and I'll try just to stick to a pithy answer on it. What the original policy was predicated on was a recognition that there is already at that time in the 90s, a well-developed private healthcare system and a well-functioning public healthcare system divided along the lines of apartheid, and which would obviously need reorganizing as far as that was concerned. And so it posited a view that with the appropriate mix of incentives and regulations, one would be able to find an integration seamlessly occurring, provided certain conditions would be met. The idea was always to have a unified healthcare system. And that was in order to ensure access to care, not universal health coverage. There's no such words in our constitution. So what did that entail? So it entailed the fact that you had about 100 odd, or at the time, I think about 200 odd medical schemes, and catering for that portion of the population, and tax-funded healthcare for the public sector. And here what happens is a clever idea that was researched and thoroughly worked through. And that was the idea that medical schemes under the Medical Schemes Act would now be able to expand their remits with appropriate amendments to the Act to bring on board for a defined set of, or what they call package of care, that sort of thing, but that is comprehensive for all of those in employment, but not earning above a threshold that would allow them to purchase existing medical cover. So how would this work? It would work through risk equalization. It would work through the private sector, extending coverage, because that's what it does, through insurance, to this cohort of employed people, presumably taking them off the burden, taking them away as a burden of the state, and letting them be cared for within this private enterprise. I recall a discussion that the CEO of Netcare at the time, Dr. Jackie Cheval, I was in the meeting, had with our finance minister at the time, Trevor Manuel, and they were discussing this issue. And Mr. Manuel asked quite clearly, but how are you able to take someone who can't pay their insurance and give them the same level of care? He says, the reason we have this, what we have right now, is because we can cost our bed. So if it costs R1 million a bed now to build and maintain, you need a bed for 250,000. We'll give you that bed for 250,000. We'll build those beds. And that is the enterprise and innovation that can come from the private sector. We know this. And so with the risk equalization in place, the categorization of the privately insured cohort was suddenly vastly expanded. At the same time, there would be a singular focus on the public health system, which is the system of first and ultimate resort for most people in the country. But it had all of the elements to make it and keep it world-class. And that's what the focus needed to be on, so that it becomes the anchor for all healthcare in the country. It becomes the healthcare provider of choice, and also the healthcare employer of choice. And the private sector will do what the private sector does in the meantime. And the regulatory framework would ensure that no one can fall through the cracks. The private sector was willing, absolutely, to go along with that, with increased regulation. And in fact, you mentioned the HMI, which also spoke to that, and which eventually got over the impediments set up by many in the private sector to what he was trying to do, and sometimes grudgingly accepted that this sector needs progressive regulation, not to kill it, not to strangle its profits, but to make it compliant with a process that will allow the public sector to be rehabilitated and provide an integrated and seamless service. In France, for example, you will be able, as a person under the healthcare system, you're able to enter any hospital. You will get exactly the same kind of care, but you will not know who owns that hospital. That is irrelevant to the practice of care. And France is regarded as having the finest system in the world. So it was an aspiration, but I think by the time we hit 2007, and the way the political environment changed, and the unhappiness of the left with the economic policies of the country, this became a victim to that. And NHI, as you could see, was just thrown up as a bit of populist polemic. No, we want everybody covered on exactly the same basis at all times for all services. And that must happen at once. None of this incremental change. And in one meeting, I was there. It happened. And, we are now here. We have a public service in disarray, on the ropes. Health workers just holding it together. Health workers going above and beyond the call of duty with poor resources to meet the needs of the people, keeping it together. But that can't last. It's fraying. We can see that. The private sector is developing its own crisis because it cannot grow its market. The economy is not growing, so there are not more people employed that can come on board. And there's no other market segment it can simply take over. So it's an unhealthy situation for the private sector as well. Sorry if I've expanded beyond your question, but I thought it was just important to bring those points.
No, it's quite helpful because it's been more questions are emerging as you speak. Therefore, two questions. I see there are quite a number of people who also want to ask a question, Dr. Mjakachis also. But I think just quick, maybe briefly, if you can respond. I think what you are saying that the private sector is not growing in terms of the population that comes to the private sector. So will that have a poor outcome for the private sector in terms of generating more profits going forward? Is that a possibility that that will be affected? And secondly, can we blame the foreigners for the poor healthcare delivery system in our country, as we've seen with the MEC of Health in Limpopo lamenting the number of foreigners coming into the country and putting the public sector under a severe strain?
So on the first question, the capacity of the private sector, it has been extremely innovative. It has done quite remarkable things, globally recognized, but it faces that one, insurmountable hurdle. There's no greater market for it. And so, in order to both maintain its profitability, as well as and sustain its service, it has to increase prices. And its market has a limit in terms of what they can pay. Right now, you and I both know, if we are on medical aid, what a chunk it takes out of our monthly income. There is a limit to that. And when that limit is hit, together with the fact that that cohort is aging and therefore in need of more care, with fewer young people joining, able to cross-subsidize the older cohort, we have a looming crisis. I don't know when it will occur, but it is a natural progression one can see. So I think finding ways of dealing with that, is the only way out for the private sector to maintain and even to grow its footprint. How it does that in the NHI model is hard to see. Unless one takes an extreme view, and this is all hypothetical, of course, that the government has given up on the public sector, that it feels it can't fix it, it can't maintain it, the bulk of it at least, and would rather use the private sector to provide care for those under its coverage. And I don't know whether this is not just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but it doesn't make any difference, really, to the public sector. And with the decline of that public sector, and I would challenge anyone to demonstrate that there is a cohesive and a coherent plan in place to revive, to restore, and to sustain a public sector like we spoke about earlier. There isn't one. And I think that, for me, is the disconnect here. So while we go on now retrofitting policy into what we think is NHI, and there may be some good stuff there as well, but while we do that, we have no focus on the public health system. its 9 provincial managements are busy on frolics of their own. There's no rhyme or reason of national standards, for example. The budgets are completely ravaged by corruption and mismanagement. And, you know, by certain estimates, that accounts for half of the entire health budget. So it's not a surprise that, and it leads me to your second question regarding foreigners. So it's not a surprise when people cast about for reasons to explain this decrepitude, when in fact it's staring them in the face. So the Institute of Security Studies released a report yesterday, a detailed study showing that the population of South Africa includes only 6% as foreigners, and that by no stretch of the imagination are they such a drain on the public services of this country, including healthcare, that invited the kind of, you know, response we've heard from certain politicians. Here's the thing. When you're in charge of a provincial health system and up to 50% of your budget is iffy, where you've only got 58% of your posts filled, then even catering for your normal population without a single foreigner entering in is a hard ask. Now that you have a foreigner coming, sure, it's an additional burden, but it's a vanishingly small burden compared to the 50% of the budget which has been mismanaged on your watch. So now, what do we do? Who do we look at for an answer on this? The politician, as politicians do everywhere, go for the weakest link, the patient in this instance. And I think in so doing, stir up the grievances of the people, the South Africans in their communities, already with such meager resources, deprived of any agency, their ability to work seriously attenuated, now having to share those resources with foreigners. You know, if the promise was real that your lot will improve, hang in there. The natural generosity of our people will come through. But the growing disillusionment with that relief arriving is fertile ground for people to stir up grievances and to make political mileage. And we know that the political calculus, both of the governing party and of the opposition, has factored in this growing xenophobic sentiment that's emerging among voters. And if you go against that, you lose those votes. So a very cynical political project is now underway. And that's unfortunately where we sit with this issue of foreigners, supposedly such a red herring, burdening our.
Yeah. I think next time we'll talk about the ethics of the conduct of the MEC in the difference.
That's a different topic.
Presentation. Thanks a lot. Dr. Mjagachi, your hand has been up for some time. I'll come back to the questions that are on the chat box. Dr. Mjagachi, if you can ask your question and unmute yourself. Charles?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you, sure. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Dasoo. Thank you. Because in all the cynicism of our time, it is liberating to listen to somebody tell the truth as it actually is. In the chat box, people are asking about the role of the public sector. Guys, Dr. Dasoo has gone to length discussing what the role of the public sector can be. I would ask Dr. Dasoo to please give the example that he gave of the French medical system, where insurance companies work in tandem with government to provide monies for a certain number of conditions and projects within the health sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Mjagaj. You want to comment?
Sure, quickly. I'll be quick with this. Thank you very much for your kind remarks there. With respect to the French health system, they have national insurance, what they call national insurance, which is just their ring-fenced healthcare budget. And it's unlimited care, but it's delivered in a system which has very few opportunities for gaming, for over-servicing, etc. And so insurers are perfectly comfortable being aligned with the national insurance in this regard, and would fund, like you said, perhaps certain packages of care. But effectively, those conditions they don't cover is covered anyway within the national system. The point I really tried to make, though, was about the delivery system. So a person who enjoys that kind of coverage may be able to attend any facility which can treat him or her, and will find that they would get the same level of care in any other facility in France that can offer that. And they'll never know who really owns that hospital, nor would they care, whether it's a private enterprise, a non-profit, or the state. The point is, they have standardized care for everyone. And there's no reason we can't do that. Of course, we've lost a lot of time. And in that loss of time, we've also probably passed some tipping points in the public system that we can't really get back and will have to be rebuilt. But that's the work of a generation. And that's the work of a government that is very serious about its own people, about the people it governs, rather, than about its own political interests. And unfortunately, modern politics, and it's not just here, you see it almost everywhere, is so interested in itself that it often makes the people victims of its overweening political ambitions. And unfortunately, we are in the thick of it here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Das. Doctor, I'll just summarize and maybe just consolidate the questions by Dr. Freddie Coleman. When you accept that NHI seems to be a problem, but that says we should not despair, and be despondent about what's happening in terms of how we increase or have increase access to healthcare in our country. But then it says, how do we get out of this situation? How do we ensure that we have access, and we meet all those conditions for ensuring that health as a public good is accessible to everybody, either using the private sector or the public sector?
Sure, you're asking for the wisdom of Solomon here. I think, no, but thanks for the question, Freddie. I appreciate that. Look, yes, I agree that we must not despair. Because if we despair, we keep quiet and we watch the deterioration grow. So if we are hopeful, then we must speak out hopefully. And even if it is to criticize, that's okay. Because that's what our democracy really promised us. And we mustn't let that be taken from us. So in this particular instance, when the fire occurred at Charlotte Maxeke in 2021 April, of course, that removes a major cog in the most complex and comprehensive regional health system on this continent. So it takes this cog out. And of course, the patients have to be decanted to the other facilities, which are under strain, we know, and which can which can rise to the challenge for a short while. And that's what happened. Patients were then transferred, and to Helen Joseph and to the other hospitals and Barra and so forth. And eventually, the strain becomes too much, especially if you don't have a commensurate resource allocation to deal with this. But you're so far behind on the normal resource allocation that now to find resources to manage this greater load is a futile exercise, given what you're capable of doing. And you're not capable of doing much, unfortunately, in the Gauteng Department of Health. You couldn't even ensure water supply to Helen Joseph and Rahima Musa, hospitals in the center of the most industrialized city on this continent, for weeks. And it took a charity to come and drill 2 boreholes to give water. And the helplessness at that time was very telling. So therein lies one solution. And it's not a complete solution, but one solution to fix up the management, to review how health facilities are provisioned, how the power relation between the facility, the community in that facility, and the department administration is regulated. Right now, it's a top-down, with the CEO of a hospital being the distal end of this management beginning at head office. Boards are effectively sweetheart boards. They therefore show mainly. They have no power. And unfortunately, the center can't provision equally all of these facilities to the extent that they need. That fire at Charlotte was a huge revelation. It was an unfortunate way to reveal things, because the facility wasn't fixed. For a year, the Department of Health and Department of Infrastructure Development bickered over how much it would cost to fix, who would fix it, and so on. In the meantime, cancer therapy lists grew, surgical lists grew. People who were transferred because there was no psychiatry wards at Charlotte, transferred to Helen Joseph, which had no further psychiatry beds, and were put in an anteroom in the casualty department without sufficient staff, 40 acutely psychotic patients at a time. What do you think is going to happen? And it happened repeatedly. Clinicians would call us from Helen Joseph and saying, it's chaos here. Walking in there would be like walking into a medieval horror show. So we must understand the impact of our decisions. We can sit in an administration office and sign off on something, and the ramifications of that are so huge, and then we can't fix it. Charlotte, a year after its fire, eventually we got together with other organizations, and we, as PHF, launched a PIA application to all the relevant departments, including the police, to find out, show us all your communication with each other. What have you done? What have you now contracted? You say the National Department of Health is involved. How is it involved? How is it contracting the DBSA? And to the South African Police Services. What did you investigate? Not a peep. We got no response. And a proper legal PIA application. We stuck with the process and went through an appeal for a further 30 days. Still got no response, except for the South African Police Services, who gave us the docket and showed us the very expert forensic report that demonstrated that the fire was an act of incendiary arson, not just a common or garden arson, that an accelerant was used very deliberately to set this fire. Now, either it was set because, and I'm being very cynical here, it was the start of a giant extraction program, and the bill from DID was going to be 1.7 billion rand, or it was part of this general mayhem we're seeing with an insurrectionist type of attacks on public infrastructure. We don't know. But the report was completed in September 2021. And according to the police, they submitted it to the government of Gauteng, who deny any knowledge of it. A year later, No further investigations. So that tells you the dysfunction is very, very deep. And I'm not sure that there is sufficient capability in the current structures to fix it. It might need an entirely new way of doing things. And who mandates that, I'm not sure. But I do know that we must not lose hope, that we didn't lose hope during COVID, even when the government locked us down for 3 months, ostensibly to say, we will fix up and we will provision our health facilities to meet the wave. They did practically nothing. And health workers, already under the cosh, stood up and somehow got us through this. So yes, they must be commended, but they will do that. That's what they trained to do ethically. But there's a limit even to that. And we are beginning to see it from the exodus of staff out of the public service, making things just worse. So Freddie, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. I don't think any one person has an answer here. But whatever it is, it's got to be so bold that the country is rally around. Thanks.
Thanks for that, sure. You were supposed to give us hope. You make it more difficult. Yes, Freddie was saying, let's not be despondent. Let us be hopeful that things can be better. But I think that response does not inspire any sense of hope. That's why.
Allow me, please, Ray, to just say this much. I'm not despondent. The fact that I talk the way I do and do the things I do tells you that I'm, still burning with the activism that got us through the 80s and through the barrier of apartheid into the democratic order. That activism, doesn't go away. But I'm not what I was 40 years ago. And there's a whole new cohort of health workers. I said it at the outset of my address today, that to those whose careers are nascent or just starting, bear in mind the systemic connectedness of healthcare. And if you have that in mind, you begin to find ideas about how to fix things. The one thing, and it might even sound a little seditious, and forgive me if it does, is a growing call for health workers to take the system into their own hands, break down the artificial barriers set by the administrators, and start delivering care in a better way. I think that has some utility in that it will move things along, but that too is limited because the purse strings are the key to fixing the system and who holds them. And unfortunately, we are now in a deadlock. Health workers, health professionals, completely at odds with the administration for daring to stifle them from speaking using apartheid laws during that time, there was an incentive to do that. What's the incentive in a democratic order to stifle the voices of health workers? None. And in fact, that's why that whole I Am movement began. Because of that frustration with an entrenched administration that can't think outside of its very regimented rules. And unfortunately, without fixing that, we go nowhere.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Farouk Mohammed is saying, that activism of the 70s and the 80s needs to come back, and that we need to do something about it. And as healthcare workers, we need to stand up. But remember, the title of this topic was about the healthcare as a business and the moral challenge. Then what does healthcare providers do now when there seems to be a collapse of the health system in our country? What role can the private healthcare sector do? I mean, that's a challenge that because they are there for business and for profit making. But now that there's a problem in terms of provision of healthcare in our country, is there a way that the private healthcare sector can collaborate with government to ensure that there's a provision of healthcare in the interim? Before we talk about NHI or national health policy, you spoke about Charlotte McDermott, the fire there. Patients are suffering, but there could be capacity in the private healthcare sector. Is there no way of collaborating?
I'm sure there is. But the first part of your question is interesting. What do health workers do now? What do health professionals do in the face of all of this? Well, I have found it, and I'm sure Farouk and others of my generation, or even earlier, also found that in their activism, that if you stick to the ethics of your profession, the answers come more easily. That even though you struggle, you get frustrated, if you stick to your ethics, you eventually break through. And we saw it recently with Dr. Tim de Meyer here at Rahima Musa. He stuck with it. He stuck with it. He begged, he pleaded, he requested, got nowhere, wrote his letter and lit a fire. That fire, believe me, shook the Gauteng Health Department. And right now, they still don't know how to deal properly with it. We've given them ideas on what to do, hold an inquiry into what happened there, public inquiry, so we get to the bottom of it. We said, set up authority within facilities, have properly constituted hospital boards, publicly appointed with due and requisite skills, who then must appoint their CEO. And in so doing, they account to that community, they manage their money, they manage their resources, rather than waiting for a pane of glass to be fixed by Department of Public Works in the provincial government, where you'll wait 3 months. So there's many things you can do swiftly to change the order. But the broader systemic problems that are causing staff to leave, that are causing a breakdown in services, those, I think, need deeper and more profound change. But it can't come unless there is a commensurate will by those in authority, in political authorities now and in the future. And, you know, so if there's an issue about how do they collaborate, how do the public and private sector, we've been doing this for 25 years. To have to still ask that question tells you we've been doing it badly. Now, I don't know if I want to place the blame on any one party. It always takes two to make a relationship work. But I can assure you that deep ideological aversion to private healthcare that still obtains in the Department of Health is a direct obstacle to making big progress on collaboration. We got through it during COVID, but it was a very corporatized thing. We got through it by doing our vaccination together and utilizing private facilities, and everyone went kumbaya. Well, you know what? It was nice. It showed what is possible, but it doesn't have any legs in the current situation. So I don't know whether the private sector is ready to take patients from the public sector who can't be treated because of a lack of resources, have them decanted to the private facilities and treated at an affordable price outside of what it takes to manage a 1 million rand bed. So I don't know. But this is what you have to think about. And the generation now emerging at the forefront, the 25s to 45s among us and 50s among us, must now take the reins. You cannot sit back deprived of agency. Take the reins. Do it. Organize yourselves. It's what we did when we were young. That was the only thing we knew how to do. I suspect you'll find great profit if you organize yourselves too. Thanks.
Last comment, it's a question or comment from Dr. Rampedi before we draw to a close. It says, on all this that we've been saying, we should not forget to mention sending students to Cuba meant to develop and enhance our permanent care services and come back to lack of posts.
Yes, it's a very fraught issue. And I have a particular link to it. I was part of at the outset of the Cuban doctor exchange initially, before the medical students program began, back in the early 90s. And I was in Cuba at the behest of President Mandela to actually do this stuff. and talk to the Cubans, because he'd already opened up negotiations on having Cuban doctors come over. I think we did have a problem that those Cuban doctors very ably resolved for us. The fact that we were very poorly provisioned with health professionals in our rural areas where most Black people lived was a real problem. And they played an immense role in providing healthcare services to those people. In so doing, passing on their primary healthcare ethic. And I think the students that go there, benefit from that primary healthcare ethic, which is in many ways what we do need to do. Now, we do have a powerful primary healthcare system. And I'll tell you this, up until 1998, from 95 to 98 or 99, we built 1,000 primary healthcare centers, or recommissioned those that were derelict. 1,000 in the largest ever clinic building program in the world. And we brought healthcare in statistical terms within 10 kilometers of every South African, primary healthcare. Now, if you take the average South African, the unemployed woman living in a village near Guyana, no visible means of support, husband probably a migrant worker, whose child gets sick with gastro, whose abiding experience is death of that child, now able to go to a clinic where a nurse can stick in a dextrose drip. And her experience has completely changed. And we thought we were onto something here. It was fantastic. It was exactly what we needed. The Cuban medical student exchange program sought to supplement our medical schools producing doctors as well. But the fact that the Cubans were willing to work with us at such scale was hugely encouraging. And those who come back, yes, there is a period of transition back into our system, but they come back with abiding lessons on how to manage primary healthcare systems, which is what we've got. And I have to say that it is an abiding disgrace that the government is unable to absorb them in the way they should have been absorbed when the plans were made. And it's, again, the same problem that the MEC in Limpopo faces, with only 58% of her posts full, because she doesn't have the money to fill in the other posts. What happened to the money for all those posts? What happened to the money for posts for doctors and nurses lying unemployed in our country? So, there's a systemic problem here, but, it needs to be worked through by those who have the capability of doing that. But it must happen. And the Cuban program, I think, has probably reached its limit in terms of what we need. Our medical schools can now produce and are beginning to expand their production of health professionals. And I think it's probably a process of, as they stand up, the Cuban program will stand down. And that's fine. But as for the Cuban students returning and other doctors not being absorbed into the public health system is an abiding disgrace. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for that comment. Yeah, Freddie, unfortunately, we won't be able to go to your question. We run out of time. And we move from one legend of the 70s to another, who was there before, last Professor Joe Verrieva, to do the closing remarks. I mean, you spoke about activism. Before your time, there were other activities.
Oh, yes.
And this is in honor of Steve Biko, that we have this lecture on ethics. And we know that Professor Joe Verrieva is one of those who stood up in defense of Stephen Bantu Biko. So ask to speak about his death and why we shouldn't keep quiet about such atrocities in our land. Professor Verrieva, if you could just do the closing remarks. It's part of our clinics as doing one of the consultants and giving us, making sure that we do things the right way, ethically, quality of care.
Thank you very much, Dr. Billa, and also Dr. Aslam Dasoo. It's nice to hear you after many years. In fact, I had heard you a while back when I had to interview you with the Council for Medical Schemes.
Yes.
And I enjoyed your talk, I must say, and you were very fluent and you made a lot of points. Quite a few of those are, I think, controversial, but I think it's also important to have controversies being raised. Even if we disagree, we should have reasons why we disagree. So clearly, there is quite a lot. And there are a lot of very valid things that you've mentioned. I like your use of the term Anthropocene. And that is very commonly used these days when we talk about the future, climate change, and the outcomes that are going to occur. And it sort of implies that it is made by humans. And it's sort of the climate change is related to starting off with the Industrial Revolution and all that. And that caused the accumulation of carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gases, and those effects. So I was impressed. But I also thought that you were implying Anthropocene in relation to the behavior of individuals that control healthcare or are in the healthcare system and are not doing what they should be doing. So clearly, it was, I think, an interesting term that comes out, and it was well used there. The issue of the private sector, and there I differ very strongly from you. And whilst you said that the NHI is a bit of a disaster type of thing, I think that we should try to get it to work correctly. We should not write off NHI. You also raised an important sort of issue on the social determinants of health. Now, the social determinants of health are very strongly operative in our country. That most of the indicators or health status indicators are clearly related to the various socio-economic determinants, whether it is family income, whether it's a level of education. There are a couple of these. And these are the things that have created a very difficult problem in the public sector because of the high morbidity from various illnesses that occur. So the public sector has a big challenge. And many of our doctors run away from us and go into the private sector, and many go into our WOPs, whilst we need them quite heavily in the public sector. So the social and economic determinants are a very important factor. And also, I would have liked to have heard from you, how do we go about it? Because it is related to poverty, it is related to education and all these factors. And how do we go about improve? We can't just go and improve the health system by saying that we got good hospitals without attending to the problems that result in them landing up in hospitals. Now, you also, and just to make, by the way, this the whole issue of Cuban doctors, or they're not Cuban doctors, they're South African trained doctors in Cuba. And also we were bringing in doctors from Cuba. And I've been involved in this whole process very, very actively. And from 2012, and I thought it's just important to put this into perspective, we started sending 1,000 students a year. And that was a very, very brave move. And I was part of 3 individuals that were the Ministerial Academic Review Committee. And we were active right up to the present time. And over this period now, we've trained about 2,600 doctors completely. the issue of them not getting post, that is not totally correct. The intern posts, all of them got their intern posts as interns and that. Many of them, the provinces are compelled to give them jobs because they have to, it's a type of paying back for all the, expenditure that the provinces had, in fact, were committed to. So that's not totally correct. The issue of innovation in the private sector, and that's the final point I'm going to make. There is no evidence, and I challenge anyone on this one, that there is better quality than in the public sector. And you must choose the type of hospitals. Say you choose Charlotte Machair Care or Helen Joseph and compare it with some of the private hospitals. There is no good scientific evidence that there is a better quality. Now, there are various parameters that we can use to assess quality. And when I was the chairperson of council, that's when it started. But we did not have all the data to be able to say that the private sector has, whilst they may be innovative in terms of how they structure their hospitals or how they increase their profits, but clearly there is no good evidence that they produce or they have a better quality of service. I do know that over-servicing is also a big issue in that area. But in many other areas, even in the public sector, you often find over-servicing. But when it comes to under-servicing, that's where the public sector falls short. However, Dr. Dasoo, I'm pleased that you still activistic. I know you went around looking at the hunger strikers many years ago, and you worked in my unit at Coronation Hospital, and it's nice hearing you again. So just keep it up. And although I am critical, I say that there are controversial issues that you raised. It is vital and important of individuals to raise these issues. We may reject them, but keep these issues alive. And for that, I think this was an excellent talk. And thank you very much on behalf of clinics, as well as on behalf of our chairperson here, Dr. Ray Villa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Thanks a lot, Prof. Thanks to Professor Vereva, and thanks Dr. Dasoo, and thanks colleagues who joined us this evening, and also come in the background there for marketing to make sure that we have this. It's been a wonderful talk. You can get this talk on YouTube. We'll send a link. Please like us on YouTube, and then you can always go and listen to this powerful presentation. I'm sure most of us would want to listen to it again. And I think it was quite befitting that we got Professor Vereva also to the closing remarks there. And thank you, colleagues, and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Sure.